Is this some kind of joke? The voice cut through the scorching Arizona air like a blade. Jason Reed, 28 years old with 3 engineering degrees and a reputation for technical brilliance, kicked the landing skid of the dormant helicopter. The dull thud echoed across the tarmac of Jefferson Air Force Base, a sound of frustration and mounting desperation. The Black Hawk helicopter, nicknamed Desert Storm, sat silent and defiant under the merciless July sun. Its rotor blades hung motionless, drooping like wilted leaves in the 105-degree heat. Around the aircraft, a dozen technicians in crisp blue coveralls stood with arms crossed, faces etched with a mixture of embarrassment and professional humiliation. Every diagnostic says it should fly. Jason wiped sweat from his forehead, leaving a streak of grease above his right eyebrow. Every system checks out green. Every circuit is intact. Every sensor is operational. He gestured at the array of advanced equipment surrounding the helicopter. A $1 million diagnostic system with 4 high-resolution screens displayed nothing but reassuring green indicators. Lieutenant Alex Bennett paced nearby, his phone pressed to his ear, nodding vigorously despite the fact that the person on the other end couldn't see him. "Yes, Colonel, I understand the urgency." Bennett's voice strained with the effort of maintaining military composure. "We're implementing all available solutions." He glanced at his watch and winced. 3 hours remained before the ceremony. 3 hours before 6 senators, the Secretary of Defense, and 200 Desert Storm veterans would be seated in the viewing stands, expecting the legendary Black Hawk to perform its memorial flight. As Bennett ended his call, Jason approached, his face grim. "We've tried everything in the book, Lieutenant, and several things that aren't. The MIT approach, the Boeing checklist, even called in that specialist from Sikorsky." Jason lowered his voice. "Sir, this bird is not going to fly today. I recommend we substitute one of the newer models. We can paint the markings to match." "Absolutely not." Bennett cut him off. "This isn't about putting any helicopter in the air. It has to be this one. Desert Storm is the centerpiece of the entire ceremony. It flew 37 combat missions during Operation Desert Storm. It evacuated the wounded from the 3rd Infantry. It's a piece of living history." The phone in Bennett's hand rang again. He looked at the screen and his face paled. "It's General Harding." The base fell quiet as Bennett answered, his posture automatically straightening, even though the general was miles away. Everyone could hear the deep voice booming through the phone. Bennett's replies became increasingly terse, his "yes, sir" responses more clipped with each passing second. When he finally lowered the phone, his expression was unreadable. "The general is sending someone, a specialist." Jason's eyebrows rose. "Better than the Sikorsky team? Who does he have the ghost of Igor Sikorsky himself?" Bennett stared at the message on his phone. "He's sending someone named Frank Sullivan." "Sullivan?" Jason scrolled through his mental database of aerospace engineers and helicopter specialists. The name triggered no recognition. "Who is he?" "Some civilian contractor. A retired engineer. All the general said was that if anyone can make Desert Storm fly again, it's Sullivan." Jason scoffed, gesturing at his team of technicians. "With all due respect to the general, we have the most qualified team on the eastern seaboard here. PhDs from MIT, Caltech, Stanford. What can this Sullivan possibly know that we don't?" Bennett didn't answer. He was looking at the helicopter with a strange expression, as though seeing it differently now. "There's something not right about this helicopter," he murmured. "It's like it's waiting for someone." The words hung in the air, oddly poetic, coming from the typically pragmatic lieutenant. Nobody laughed, because in the silence, as they all regarded the stubborn machine, they could almost feel it, the sense that Desert Storm was more than metal and wires. It had a presence, a history, perhaps even a soul. 70 miles away in a small house nestled against the foothills of the Superstition Mountains, Frank Sullivan sat at his workbench. Afternoon light filtered through dusty windows, casting golden patterns across the wooden surface, where a disassembled pocket watch lay in precise formation. At 78 years old, Sullivan's hands remained remarkably steady as he peered through a jeweler's loupe, carefully aligning the tiny escapement mechanism. His modest living room doubled as a workshop. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with technical manuals, history books, and dog-eared novels. A worn leather recliner faced a small television that rarely saw use. The mantel above a never-used fireplace held 3 framed photographs, Sullivan as a young man in uniform. His late wife, Sarah, her smile radiant against a backdrop of desert flowers, and their son Michael in graduation cap and gown, now a successful surgeon in Seattle who called dutifully on holidays and birthdays. The house reflected its owner's neat functional with no pretensions. Through the front window, an American flag hung from a pole on the porch, faded but meticulously maintained. In the driveway, a 1967 Chevrolet pickup truck sat in the same condition, aging but impeccably cared for. Sullivan moved with the deliberate precision of a man who had spent his life working with his hands. A slight limp marked his gait, a souvenir from the war that had defined his youth but which he rarely discussed. The scars on his forearms and the permanently bent little finger on his left hand told stories he kept to himself. His morning routine never varied. Coffee at 6 black, the newspaper at 6:15, a slow walk to check his mailbox at 7. Every Sunday, regardless of weather, he drove to the small cemetery where Sarah rested beneath a simple headstone. He brought desert wildflowers when they bloomed and spoke to her as though she were sitting beside him. In a corner of the living room, nearly hidden behind the door, hung a shadow box. Inside, military decorations gathered dust, Bronze Star purple heart ribbons, and medals Sullivan never mentioned. Unlike many veterans, he displayed no military memorabilia, kept no souvenirs visible. The past remained precisely where he believed it belonged in the past. The telephone rang, shattering the quiet. Sullivan looked up, frowning. Few people had his number, and fewer still ever used it. He set down his tools carefully and crossed to the kitchen, picking up the receiver on the fourth ring. Sullivan. The voice on the other end was familiar, though he hadn't heard it in nearly 2 decades. Frank, it's Sam Harding. Sullivan's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a straightening of the spine, an echo of military bearing that never truly leaves a soldier. General, it's been a while. It has. I need you, Frank. 3 simple words. Sullivan closed his eyes briefly. The last time he'd heard those words from Harding, they'd both been younger men in a desert half a world away, surrounded by fire and chaos. I'm retired, Sam. Have been for a long time. It's Desert Storm. Sullivan's hand tightened on the receiver. A flash of memory, the distinctive vibration of rotor blades, the smell of aviation fuel and hot metal sand that found its way into everything. What about her? She won't fly. We have a ceremony today, 30th anniversary of the Gulf War. 200 veterans, dignitaries, the works. The best technicians can't figure it out. Everything checks out, but she won't start. Sullivan was silent for a long moment. He glanced at the photograph of Sarah on the mantel. Sam, I made a promise to Sarah before she died. No more missions. This isn't a mission, Frank. It's a homecoming. That helicopter saved both our lives more than once. Don't you think you owe her a goodbye? Sullivan sighed, running a hand through his thinning white hair. Jefferson Base, that's what they call it now. Yes, I can send a car. No, I'll drive myself. Sullivan paused. I'm not making any promises, Sam. Just come take a look. That's all I ask. After hanging up, Sullivan stood motionless in his kitchen. He turned to Sarah's photograph. What do you think, love? They want the old ghost to fly one more time. A faint smile crossed his weathered face. You always said I'd never really retired anyway. From the closet in his bedroom behind neatly hung shirts and pants, Sullivan retrieved an old leather tool bag. The leather was cracked and dark with age, the strap reinforced with stitching that didn't match the original. He set it on his bed, hesitating before opening it. Inside, nestled in custom-fitted pouches, lay a collection of tools unlike any standard set. Many were clearly handmade, others modified from their original forms. Each bore the marks of extensive use, yet all were spotlessly clean and organized with military precision. His fingers brushed something at the bottom of the bag, a small metal tag with faded numbers stamped into it. The aircraft identification plate from Desert Storm's first incarnation. He'd removed it when the helicopter received its new designation, keeping it as his only souvenir from the war. Not a trophy, but a reminder. Sullivan closed the bag and straightened. He changed into clean jeans and a sand-colored jacket that had once been military issue, but now bore no insignia. As he passed the mirror in the hallway, he barely glanced at his reflection. A lean, weathered face, eyes still sharp and clear beneath bushy white eyebrows. He didn't see himself as others might, a relic from another time, carrying himself with the quiet dignity of men who had seen too much, but carried on nonetheless. The Chevy started on the first try as it always did. Sullivan pulled onto the highway, the familiar rumble of the engine settling into his bones. The radio played a news segment about the memorial ceremony at Jefferson Base, the announcer speaking of honoring forgotten heroes with polished insincerity. Sullivan switched it off. He'd never considered himself a hero, just a mechanic who did what needed doing. As the desert landscape rushed past his windows, he wondered what Sarah would say about this unexpected detour back into his past. Probably that he'd never really left it behind in the first place. The security checkpoint at Jefferson Air Force Base had changed since Sullivan's day. Concrete barriers scanning equipment, armed guards a reflection of a different world than the one he'd known in uniform. The young airman at the gate, barely old enough to buy a beer, regarded Sullivan's ancient military ID card with suspicious eyes. "Sir, this ID expired 15 years ago." The airman turned the laminated card over in his hands. "I can't accept this entry." Sullivan nodded patiently. "Call General Harding's office. Tell them Frank Sullivan is here." The airman looked skeptical, but made the call. Sullivan waited, watching aircraft take off in the distance, feeling the vibrations through the soles of his boots. The familiar sensation triggered another memory standing on the tarmac in Saudi Arabia as helicopters departed for the first night of Operation Desert Storm, the air electric with nervous energy and the knowledge that not everyone would return. The airman's expression changed as he listened to his radio. He straightened noticeably. "Yes, sir. Right away, sir." He returned Sullivan's ID with newfound respect. "Sorry for the delay, Mr. Sullivan. The general says to escort you directly to Hangar 7. As Sullivan drove through the base following the security vehicle, he observed how much had changed. New buildings gleamed with glass and steel. Advanced aircraft he didn't recognize sat on the flight line. Young service members moved with purpose, their uniforms crisp and clean, in a way that felt foreign to a man who remembered uniforms perpetually stained with hydraulic fluid and coated with fine desert sand. They parked outside a massive hangar where a crowd had gathered around a helicopter, sitting isolated on the tarmac. Even from a distance, Sullivan recognized the distinctive silhouette of the Black Hawk. And not just any Black Hawk, this one he would know blindfolded. Desert Storm. Sullivan grabbed his tool bag and stepped out of his truck, the Arizona heat hitting him like a physical force. His leg ached, an old injury that barometric pressure and humidity aggravated, but he ignored it as he had for decades. He stood for a moment, absorbing the scene before approaching. The technicians swarming around the helicopter reminded him of doctors around a patient, their movements increasingly desperate as treatments failed. As he walked toward the aircraft, Sullivan felt oddly disconnected from his surroundings, as though moving between two worlds: the present, with its digital diagnostics and composite materials, and the past with its analog gauges and riveted aluminum. His mind flashed to another tarmac another time. The smell of cordite, the sound of wounded men crying out. The weight of responsibility crushing down on him as he worked frantically to keep machines flying while lives depended on his skill. The security airman announced Mr. Sullivan to see General Harding, but his words barely registered with the busy technicians. A young officer who could only be Lieutenant Bennett looked up from his tablet, glanced at Sullivan, then looked past him as if expecting someone else. "Mr. Sullivan," Bennett frowned. "You're the specialist the general sent." Before Sullivan could answer, a tall man with close-cropped hair and an MIT sweatshirt stepped forward. The confidence in his stance, the slight condescension in his expression, Sullivan had seen it countless times before. Young men who believed knowledge came primarily from books and computers. "I'm Jason Reed, lead technician." He didn't offer his hand. "The general mentioned you worked with this airframe during Desert Storm." Sullivan nodded, his eyes not on Jason but on the helicopter beyond him. "You could say that." He moved past the technicians, approaching Desert Storm with the reverence of a man greeting an old friend. The helicopter sat silent, its black paint absorbing the sun's heat. Sullivan set down his tool bag and placed his palm flat against the fuselage, feeling the warmth of the metal through his skin. "Hello, old girl," he said softly. "Been a long time." Jason exchanged glances with his team, several of whom smirked openly. One made a twirling motion near his temple, the universal sign for crazy. "Mr. Sullivan," Jason said, his voice louder than necessary, "we've run every diagnostic possible. The engines are getting fuel, the electrical systems check out, the computer shows no faults. This is a mechanical issue beyond visual inspection." Sullivan didn't respond immediately. He was examining a specific spot on the helicopter's fuselage, a barely perceptible irregularity in the paint near an access panel. His fingers traced a pattern only he could see. "You were there," he said finally. "February 27, 91. The helicopter, of course, didn't answer, but Sullivan nodded as if it had. Jason cleared his throat. "Mr. Sullivan, I'm sure you have fond memories of this aircraft, but we're facing a critical situation. The ceremony begins in less than 3 hours. We need solutions, not nostalgia." Sullivan straightened and looked at Jason directly for the first time. His pale blue eyes were startlingly clear in his weathered face. "Son, you're looking at the problem with your machines. But helicopters aren't just machines, they're living things with memories and scars. This one remembers things your computers can't measure." The technicians didn't bother hiding their eye-rolling now. Jason's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Look, I respect your service, sir, but with all due respect, we're using 2025 technology, not 1991 technology. The problems that existed in your day have been engineered out of existence." Sullivan smiled faintly. "Some problems can't be engineered away. Some have to be felt." He pointed to an access panel near the main engine housing. "This panel, it's not sitting flush." Jason sighed dramatically but bent to examine the panel. He ran his hand over it, then looked up with barely concealed annoyance. "It's within tolerance, maybe a 16th of an inch off at most. The tolerances allow for an eighth. We checked this already." "Not with Desert Storm," Sullivan said quietly. "Her tolerances were always tighter. That's how we kept her flying when others couldn't." For a moment, something like doubt flickered across Jason's face. Then his expression hardened again. "Mr. Sullivan, I have 3 doctoral degrees in aerospace engineering. My team has a combined 50 years of experience with advanced avionics. We've been working on this helicopter for 6 hours with the most sophisticated diagnostic equipment ever developed. I think we would have noticed if a simple access panel was the issue." Sullivan didn't argue. He simply crouched beside the panel, his old joints protesting, and ran his fingers along the seam. As he touched a specific spot, his mind flashed to another time. His younger self crouched in the same position, but surrounded by swirling sand and the distant sound of artillery. His hands covered in blood, some his own, some from the wounded soldier he'd just loaded into the helicopter. The desperate race against time to implement a modification that would allow Desert Storm to fly higher faster, carrying more weight than she was designed to bear. The memory was so vivid that for a moment the heat of the Arizona sun transformed into the blistering heat of the Iraqi desert. The sound of air conditioners became the thrum of distant helicopter rotors. The clean scent of the airbase morphed into the acrid smell of burning oil wells. Sullivan blinked, returning to the present. He looked up at Jason. "This panel conceals a modification I made 30 years ago. A secondary fuel bypass system that won't appear in any manual or schematic." Jason crossed his arms. "That's impossible. We have complete technical drawings from Boeing. Every modification is documented." "Not this one. This was a field modification made under combat conditions, never officially recorded." Lieutenant Bennett had been listening to the exchange with growing impatience. He stepped forward. "Mr. Sullivan, while we appreciate your insights, we can't start removing access panels based on undocumented modifications that may or may not exist. We have protocols to follow." Sullivan rose slowly to his feet and his eyes never leaving the panel. "Those protocols won't make her fly. You need to open this panel." Jason's frustration boiled over. "There is nothing wrong behind that panel. The fuel pressure is perfect. The electronics are perfect. The hydraulics are perfect. Every system shows green. Opening that panel will just waste more time we don't have." Around them, the other technicians had stopped pretending to work. They watched the confrontation with undisguised interest, most clearly siding with their team leader against the old man who had appeared from nowhere to challenge their expertise. Among them, only one, a young airman named Michael Peterson, observed with different eyes. Something about Sullivan reminded him of his own grandfather, a Korean War veteran who had fixed farm equipment with tools he'd made himself and who could diagnose engine problems by sound alone. Grandfather Peterson had taught him that machines spoke a language few people bothered to learn anymore. Sullivan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When he spoke, the quiet authority in his tone made several technicians straighten involuntarily. Your computers don't know this helicopter. I do. I've had my hands inside every system. I've bled on her floors. I've felt her respond when everything said she shouldn't fly. And right now she's telling me there's a problem behind this panel. Lieutenant Bennett had reached his limit. His career flashed before his eyes, the promising officer who failed to get a historical aircraft airborne for a high-profile ceremony attended by his superiors in the media. His voice hardened into command. That's enough. Mr. Sullivan, you are a civilian on a secure military installation. You have no authority here. He stepped closer, invading Sullivan's personal space. I'm ordering you to step away from the aircraft. Now. Sullivan didn't move. The two men stood face to face, Bennett crisp in his uniform, flush with the authority of his rank. Sullivan weathered and unassuming in his old jacket, drawing on a different kind of authority altogether. I've seen too many young men like you die in the desert, Lieutenant, Sullivan said, his voice low. Don't make me disappointed in one I helped save. Bennett blinked, confusion momentarily replacing anger. Then his jaw set. He placed his hand on Sullivan's shoulder, preparing to physically move him away from the helicopter. The moment Bennett's hand made contact, Sullivan's mind catapulted back through time. The touch became the desperate grasp of a wounded soldier. The bright Arizona day transformed into night. The silence of the base became the roar of helicopter rotors and enemy fire. Desert Storm, February 27, 1991, the last night of the war. Sullivan hanging half outside the helicopter's frame, makeshift tools in hand, the aircraft juddering violently as the pilot pushed it beyond safe limits. Below, a special operations team pinned down by enemy fire. Among them, a young lieutenant named Samuel Harding, who would go on to become the general who now commanded this base. The helicopter had been hit, fuel lines damaged, the standard systems failing. Sullivan implementing the bypasses system he'd designed after their third mission when they'd almost lost everything. A system that existed in no manual because there hadn't been time for paperwork when lives were at stake. Sullivan could feel the hot wind rushing past the helicopter, pitched at an impossible angle, his safety harness the only thing keeping him from falling to his death as he worked. The smell of fuel, the stickiness of blood on his tools, the weight of knowing that if he failed, American soldiers would die in a foreign desert. The memory lasted only seconds, but when Sullivan's awareness returned to the present, his eyes held a different quality. Not anger, not defiance, but absolute certainty. Take your hand off me, Lieutenant, he said quietly, and let me save your career. Lieutenant Bennett didn't remove his hand from Sullivan's shoulder. If anything, his grip tightened, a physical manifestation of the control he felt slipping away. Around them, the technicians watched in uncomfortable silence. This had escalated beyond professional disagreement into something more personal, more primal. That's enough, Sullivan. Bennett's voice carried the edge of a man unaccustomed to being challenged. Security will escort you to the base exit. Before Sullivan could respond, young Airman Peterson stepped forward, breaking ranks in a move that clearly surprised his colleagues. Sir, what if he's right? All eyes turned to Peterson. The young airman swallowed hard but continued. My grandfather always said machines talk to the people who know them best. Maybe we should listen. Bennett's face darkened. Airman, return to your post. This is not a democracy. No, sir, it's not, Peterson agreed. But it is about completing the mission. If Mr. Sullivan knows something we don't, he doesn't, Jason cut in. This is pure superstition. Helicopters don't talk to people. They're machines, not pets. Sullivan remained still under Bennett's grip, his eyes now fixed on Peterson. The young airman reminded him of another eager kid he'd known decades ago, one who had listened when others wouldn't and saved lives as a result. The panel, Sullivan said, his voice steady. Open it and I'll show you. Jason threw up his hands in exasperation. This is ridiculous, Lieutenant. We're wasting valuable time on this folklore. Bennett hesitated, caught between his certainty that the technical team was right and the nagging possibility that they might be wrong. His phone buzzed, another call from command, another demand for updates he couldn't provide. 15 minutes, he decided abruptly. Sullivan gets 15 minutes to check his panel. Then we move on to real solutions. He released Sullivan's shoulder and stepped back. Jason, give him access to the tools he needs. Jason's protest died on his lips at Bennett's expression. Reluctantly, he gestured to the tool cart. Help yourself. Sullivan shook his head. I have my own. He crouched beside his leather bag and opened it, revealing the collection of specialized tools. The technicians leaned in despite themselves, professional curiosity overcoming skepticism at the sight of tools they didn't recognize. Sullivan selected what appeared to be a custom wrench, its form suggesting it had been hand-forged for a specific purpose. As his fingers closed around it, his expression softened. Momentarily, a man reconnecting with part of himself long set aside. He approached the access panel again, this time with purpose. The wrench fit perfectly over the first fastener, a specialized bolt with an unusual head pattern. The technicians exchanged glances as Sullivan removed 4 fasteners that by all appearances should have required different tools. "That's not standard hardware," one of them murmured. "No," Sullivan agreed without looking up. "It's not." With the fasteners removed, Sullivan carefully lifted away the access panel, revealing a compact mechanical assembly nestled among the aircraft's systems. Jason pushed forward to see his skepticism momentarily forgotten in the face of unknown technology. "What am I looking at?" he demanded. Sullivan pointed to a small valve assembly connected to the helicopter's fuel system. "Secondary fuel bypass. Desert Storm took a hit during an extraction mission. Standard fuel controller was damaged. This routes fuel around the damaged section while maintaining precise pressure control." Jason frowned, studying the modification. "This isn't in any of the schematics. This shouldn't be here at all." "No, it shouldn't," Sullivan agreed. "But without it, 18 men would have died that night." He pointed to a small lever in the assembly that was set to one position. "This should be here." He moved it to a different setting with a soft click. Jason's engineering mind was racing, analyzing the modification. Despite his skepticism, he couldn't deny the elegance of the solution, a field-expedient repair that had become a permanent enhancement using principles that weren't so different from modern systems, but implemented with remarkable ingenuity given the constraints. "You designed this in the field." The respect in Jason's voice was grudging but real. Sullivan nodded. "When you don't have a factory or an engineering team, you make do with what you have." He replaced the access panel and carefully tightened each fastener. The system was designed to revert to standard operation when not needed. Over time, vibration must have moved the control lever. Your computers wouldn't detect it because, as far as they know, this system doesn't exist. Bennett checked his watch. 12 minutes left of your 15, Sullivan. What now? Now we start her up. Sullivan gathered his tools and returned them to his bag. Who's your pilot? No pilot yet. We can't request one until we know she'll fly. Sullivan looked at Jason. You know the startup procedure? Jason bristled. Of course I do. I've started dozens of Blackhawks. But not this one. Sullivan gestured to the cockpit. After you. The technicians gathered around the helicopter as Jason climbed into the pilot's seat and Sullivan took the co-pilot position. Through the windscreen, they could see Jason running through the pre-start checklist with the precision of a man determined to prove himself. Sullivan sat quietly beside him, watching without interfering. When Jason reached for the starter switch, Sullivan placed a hand on his arm. Wait. He pointed to a gauge that was reading within normal parameters. Watch this during startup. If it spikes past 70, shut down immediately. Jason nodded tensely. He engaged the starter. The familiar whine of turbines spooling up filled the air. The gauge Sullivan had indicated began to rise 60-65, hovering at 68. The engine caught the sound, building to a healthy roar. Then something changed, a fluctuation in the pitch. The gauge suddenly dropped to 0. The engine coughed once and died. Damn it! Jason slammed his hand against the instrument panel. I told you this wouldn't work. Sullivan hadn't moved. His eyes were fixed on another indicator, one Jason hadn't been watching. Try again. But this time when you hear the pitch change, ease back on the throttle for 2 seconds, then advance it slowly. Jason wanted to argue to insist that wasn't the proper procedure, but with time running out and no better options, he restarted the sequence. This time when the engine note changed, he followed Sullivan's instructions. The momentary reduction in throttle followed by the gradual increase. The gauge Sullivan had indicated stayed steady. The engine note strengthened, smoothed out. The distinctive thump, thump, thump of rotor blades cutting air began to build as the main rotor turned slowly at first, then faster. Outside, the technicians broke into spontaneous applause. Lieutenant Bennett stared in disbelief, his phone forgotten in his hand. Airman Peterson's face split into a wide grin. Inside the cockpit, Jason couldn't hide his amazement. How did you know? Sullivan's eyes crinkled at the corners, not quite a smile, but close. The sound. She always had a particular voice. He nodded to the instruments. Run her through the full check sequence. She should be fine now. As Jason methodically tested each system, Sullivan gazed out the windscreen, his mind once again straddling past and present. Desert Storm was flying again. The familiar vibration through the airframe, the scent of warm hydraulic fluid and metal, the cockpit that had been his second home during the most intense period of his life. He thought of Sarah waiting at home during those long deployments, the promise he'd made her when he finally retired. No more missions, no more risk, no more putting machines before people. All systems green, Jason announced, unable to keep the wonder from his voice. She's fully operational. Sullivan nodded unsurprised. She was always reliable, once you understood her quirks. As they prepared to power down, Lieutenant Bennett's voice came through their headsets. Keep her running. General Harding is inbound. ETA 3 minutes. Jason looked at Sullivan. The general's coming here. Now, Sullivan's expression remained neutral, but something in his eyes suggested he'd expected this. Seems like it. They exited the cockpit to find a transformed scene on the tarmac. The technicians were jubilant, running final checks with newfound energy. Lieutenant Bennett stood at attention, his posture rigid as he watched the base entrance. In the distance, a procession of black vehicles with small flags on their hoods approached it at high speed. Only Airman Peterson noticed that Sullivan had moved slightly apart from the group, his posture changing subtly, becoming both more formal and somehow more distant. The old man's eyes were fixed on the approaching motorcade, his expression unreadable, except for a slight tightening around his mouth. Peterson stepped closer. Sir, are you all right? Sullivan glanced at him, something like appreciation flickering in his eyes. Fine, son. Just preparing for a reunion 30 years in the making. The convoy of vehicles screeched to a halt on the tarmac. From the lead SUV emerged a tall figure in full-dress uniform adorned with the stars of a general. General Samuel Harding moved with the purposeful stride of a man accustomed to command, his face set in stern lines as he surveyed the scene before him. His gaze passed over the technicians, over Lieutenant Bennett standing at rigid attention over the now humming helicopter. It came to rest on Sullivan standing slightly apart, his old leather tool bag at his feet, the desert-colored jacket hanging loose on his frame. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the steady beat of Desert Storm's rotors, turning lazily overhead, a rhythmic pulse like the beating heart of a warrior awakened from long slumber. The confrontation that had been building, the clash between old and new, between experience and technology, between memory and progress, hovered on the edge of resolution. In the seconds before General Harding spoke, before the truth was revealed, each person present felt the weight of something momentous about to occur. Sullivan alone seemed untouched by the tension. He stood with the quiet dignity of a man who had nothing to prove, who had already fought his battles and made his peace with both victory and loss. In his weathered face was written a history few could read, and fewer still could understand, the story of a man who had danced with death in the skies over foreign lands, who had held the lives of others in his skilled hands, who had faced the impossible and refused to yield. The moment stretched taut with possibility, and as General Harding drew breath to speak, the past and present seemed to merge, two timelines converging on this sun-baked tarmac, where an old warrior and his mechanical counterpart had found each other once again. General Samuel Harding stood motionless on the tarmac, his eyes locked on Frank Sullivan. The background noise seemed to fade, the helicopter's steady thrum, the murmurs of the technicians, even the hot Arizona wind sweeping across the base, all receded as two old warriors regarded each other across 30 years of memory and silence. Harding moved first. His stride purposeful and direct, he walked straight to Sullivan, bypassing Lieutenant Bennett's rigid salute, ignoring Jason Reed's attempt to report. The general stopped 3 feet from Sullivan, drew himself to his full height, and snapped a perfect salute that would have impressed the strictest drill instructor at West Point. Master Sergeant Frank "the Ghost" Sullivan. Harding's voice carried across the tarmac, deliberately loud enough for everyone to hear. Air Force Cross, 2 silver stars, 3 purple hearts. The finest helicopter technician ever to serve in the United States military. Sullivan returned the salute with the understated precision of a man who had performed the gesture thousands of times. General, been a while. Too long. Harding lowered his hand but maintained his formal posture. I see you've reacquainted yourself with an old friend. He nodded toward the running helicopter. She remembered me. Sullivan's voice carried no hint of vindication, no trace of triumph over the technicians who had dismissed him. Just needed a little reminder of who she is. Harding turned to face the assembled crew, his expression hardening as he surveyed their faces. His gaze lingered on Lieutenant Bennett, whose complexion had gone ashen, and Jason Reed, who couldn't quite meet the general's eyes. Let me make something absolutely clear to every person present. Harding's voice took on the razor edge of command. The man standing before you is a living legend of Air Force aviation. This is Master Sergeant Frank the Ghost Sullivan, recipient of the Air Force Cross, 4 Valor, 2 Silver Stars, and 3 Purple Hearts. He paused, letting the weight of those decorations register. Even Jason, for all his technical education, knew enough military history to understand the significance. The Air Force Cross was second only to the Medal of Honor. During Operation Desert Storm, Harding continued, Sergeant Sullivan personally saved 67 American lives in a single night when 6 Black Hawks were grounded by a sandstorm. He modified them to fly in conditions that the manufacturer said were impossible. He flew 5 consecutive extraction missions, was wounded on the 3rd, refused evacuation, and continued working for 36 hours straight. The technicians stared at Sullivan with new eyes. The unassuming old man in the worn jacket suddenly transformed in their perception, not a relic but a hero whose name should have been in their textbooks. The helicopter you've spent 6 hours failing to fix, Harding's voice sharpened further, has a nickname, Desert Storm. It was Sergeant Sullivan's personal aircraft. The modifications he made to this helicopter became standard on later models. The techniques he developed under combat conditions informed the entire next generation of military aircraft design. Lieutenant Bennett looked physically ill. Jason's face had drained of color. Sir, Bennett began. We had no idea, clearly. Harding cut him off. And that, Lieutenant, is a failure I intend to address at the highest levels of this command. Sullivan stepped forward, his movement catching Harding by surprise. Sam, he said quietly, using the general's first name for the first time. They're good men, just from a different time. He glanced at the younger technicians. They trust their screens. It's what they were taught. The simple grace of Sullivan's intervention, defending the very men who had humiliated him, seemed to affect the technicians more deeply than the general's rebuke. Jason stared at the ground, the full weight of his arrogance crashing down on him. Harding studied Sullivan for a moment, then nodded slightly. Always were too forgiving, Frank. He turned to Bennett. Lieutenant, I expect this helicopter ready for the ceremony, and he checked his watch. 90 minutes. Sergeant Sullivan has full authority over all aspects of preparation. Anything he requests you provide immediately. Is that clear? Yes, sir. Bennett's reply was instant. Reed, Harding addressed Jason directly. You will personally assist Sergeant Sullivan. Consider it an education you won't get at MIT. Yes, sir. Jason's voice was subdued. As the general turned back to Sullivan, something in his stern demeanor softened. For a brief moment, the 4-star general disappeared, replaced by a much younger man, a lieutenant who had once huddled in a desert foxhole watching the sky for a helicopter. That logic said couldn't possibly fly through the sandstorm to rescue him. It's good to see you, Frank. Harding's voice was quieter now. When this is over, we should catch up. It's been too long. Sullivan nodded, a ghost of a smile crossing his weathered face. I'd like that, Sam. With that, the general departed, leaving behind a transformed atmosphere. The helicopter continued its steady beating rhythm above them, the sound no longer one of mechanical operation, but something more like a heartbeat, the pulse of a story not yet finished, a past not fully reconciled with the present. Sullivan turned to Jason, who stood awkwardly, unable to find words adequate to the moment. Well, Sullivan said matter-of-factly, we've got a helicopter to prepare. Let's get to work. Iraq, February 1991. Operation Desert Storm. The sandstorm had appeared without warning, the towering wall of orange-brown fury sweeping across the desert plain. Within minutes, visibility dropped to 0. The temperature plummeted as the sun disappeared behind the swirling mass of fine particles. At Forward Operating Base Condor, Master Sergeant Frank Sullivan, then 44 years old, stood in the doorway of the maintenance hangar, little more than a glorified tent with aluminum supports, watching the storm engulf the perimeter. Behind him, 6 Black Hawk helicopters sat in various states of disassembly, undergoing routine maintenance. The radio crackled with increasing urgency. Condor Base, this is Raptor 6. We are taking heavy fire. Requesting immediate extraction. Coordinates to follow. Over. Sullivan recognized the voice Captain Samuel Harding, leading a special reconnaissance team that had been inserted behind enemy lines 3 days earlier. Their intelligence had proven crucial in the opening phase of the ground war. Now they were compromised, surrounded, and fighting for survival. Major Reynolds, the base commander, grabbed the radio. Raptor 6, this is Condor Actual. Acknowledged. Stand by. He switched to the internal channel. Status of air assets. The operations officer looked grim. All helicopters are down for maintenance, sir. And even if they weren't, no pilot would fly in this storm. Visibility 0, particulate levels off the charts. The engines would flame out in minutes. Reynolds locked eyes with Sullivan. Sergeant, please tell me you have good news. Sullivan's mind was already racing through possibilities, calculations, modifications. The closest bird to operational status is number 37. Desert Storm. Give me 3 hours. Captain Harding's team doesn't have 3 hours, Reynolds replied. Sullivan nodded grimly. Then give me 1. And find me a pilot crazy enough to fly into that. He pointed at the raging sandstorm. You'll get both, Reynolds promised. Sullivan turned to his maintenance crew, 6 men who looked as exhausted as he felt after 2 weeks of continuous operations. Anderson Watson with me on Desert Storm. Phillips, start pulling the extra filters from the storage containers. Martinez, I need the experimental intake system we were working on last week. Thompson, find those special lubricants we got from the British. Ramirez, get every tool we have to Desert Storm right now. The men scattered, moving with the precision of a team that had worked together under pressure before. Sullivan approached the helicopter designated Desert Storm, his mind already visualizing the modifications required. Standard air intakes wouldn't survive the sandstorm. The fine particles would destroy the turbine blades in minutes. The experimental system they'd been developing might work, but it had never been tested in actual combat conditions. No choice. 18 men would die without air support. Sullivan worked with methodical urgency, his hands moving with the confidence of intimate familiarity. This particular helicopter had been under his care since it arrived in theater. He knew every bolt, every wire, every idiosyncrasy of its systems. Under different circumstances, the modifications he was attempting would require weeks of engineering, review testing, and certification. He had 58 minutes. The modifications centered on 3 critical systems. First, the air intake required a multi-stage filtration system that would prevent the fine desert particles from reaching the turbine blades, while still allowing sufficient airflow for the engines to generate power. Second, the fuel injection system needed recalibration to maintain proper combustion in the altered air mixture. Third and most critical, Sullivan implemented a bypass system of his own design, a mechanical failsafe that would allow manual control of fuel flow if the electronic systems were compromised. As he worked, sweat soaking through his uniform, despite the temperature drop from the storm, Sullivan became aware of someone watching him. He glanced up to see Major Reynolds with a young pilot, Lieutenant Mackenzie. He's our best pilot, Reynolds said simply. Sullivan sized up Mackenzie Young, maybe 25, with the confident bearing of a man who believed in his own abilities. This won't be like any flying you've done before, Lieutenant. Visibility 0, turbulence severe, navigation by instruments only, and even those might not be reliable. Mackenzie nodded. I understand, Sergeant, but those are our guys out there. Sullivan appreciated the simple response. No bravado, no unnecessary promises. Just acknowledgement of the stakes and the duty. One more thing, Sullivan wiped grease from his hands. I'm coming with you. Reynolds frowned. That's not standard procedure, Sergeant. Neither is flying into a Category 5 sandstorm, sir. The modifications I'm making might need adjustment in flight. If something goes wrong, Lieutenant Mackenzie won't be able to fix it. I can. The major hesitated, then nodded. Your call, Sergeant. But if you don't make it back, I lose my best mechanic and 18 soldiers. Sullivan managed a grim smile. Then we'd better make it back, sir. 47 minutes later, Desert Storm's engines roared to life, the sound muted by the howling wind outside the hangar. The modified intakes performed better than Sullivan had dared hope, pulling in air while rejecting the majority of the sand particles. The fuel system hummed smoothly, the bypass ready if needed. As they prepared for takeoff, Sullivan secured his safety harness and double-checked the tool bag attached to his belt. If anything failed during flight, those tools would be the difference between life and death for everyone aboard. "Ready, Sergeant?" Lieutenant Mackenzie asked through the intercom. Sullivan gave a thumbs up. "Let's bring our boys home, Lieutenant." Desert Storm lifted off into the maelstrom, immediately buffeted by powerful wind currents. Visibility extended barely beyond the cockpit windows. The navigation system struggled to maintain satellite links through the electromagnetic interference generated by the storm. 10 minutes into the flight, the first warning light illuminated engine temperature rising beyond normal parameters. Sullivan moved immediately, adjusting the bypass system he'd installed, rerouting fuel flow to compensate. The temperature stabilized but remained higher than he would have liked. 20 minutes in, they encountered turbulence, so severe that loose equipment rattled against the cabin walls. The helicopter pitched violently, momentarily pointing almost vertically, before Mackenzie wrestled it back to level flight. "How much further?" Sullivan shouted over the roar surrounding them. "3 minutes to target," Mackenzie replied. His voice strained with concentration. "If the GPS is right, big if." Sullivan nodded, then froze as a new sound reached his ears, a subtle change in the pitch of the port engine, a slight hesitation in its rhythm. Most would never have noticed it beneath the cacophony of the storm, but to Sullivan it screamed of impending failure. "Port engine's going critical," he said, already unbuckling his harness. "Keep her steady as you can." What followed would later become legend among Air Force maintenance crews, the story of how Frank Sullivan performed emergency repairs on a helicopter engine while suspended outside the aircraft in a Category 5 sandstorm. With one hand gripping a safety strap and the other working his specialized tools, Sullivan accessed an external panel that, according to maintenance manuals, should never be opened during flight. The sand tore at his exposed skin, feeling like thousands of tiny razor blades. The wind threatened to tear him from his precarious position. The engine heat blistered his hands as he worked. But his movements never faltered. His focus never wavered. When enemy fire erupted around them as they approached Captain Harding's position, Sullivan barely registered it. His world had narrowed to the task before him. The bypass system needed manual adjustment to compensate for damage to the main fuel control unit. His custom-made wrench, the very same one he would use 30 years later on an Arizona tarmac, made the critical adjustment possible. The engine stabilized. Desert Storm descended through the storm to a rocky outcropping where 18 American soldiers fought desperately against overwhelming odds. The extraction took less than 2 minutes, a testament to both Mackenzie's piloting skills and the soldiers' discipline. As they lifted off, enemy fire intensified. A round punched through the helicopter's skin, missing Sullivan by inches. Another struck the starboard engine cowling, sending fragments of metal into his left arm. Blood flowed, but Sullivan barely noticed. The starboard engine began to falter, its rhythm disrupted. Again, Sullivan moved to repair damage that the manuals classified as non-repairable in flight. Again, he exposed himself to the elements, his blood mixing with the sand and grease on his tools. Captain Harding, despite his own wounds, crawled forward to assist, holding Sullivan's safety line as the helicopter fought its way back through the storm. When they finally landed at Forward Operating Base Condor, Sullivan collapsed on the tarmac, exhausted and bleeding from multiple wounds. Desert Storm's engines were on the verge of failure, her systems pushed far beyond their design limitations. But she had made it. Everyone had made it. As medical personnel rushed to treat the wounded soldiers, Captain Harding knelt beside Sullivan. "They told us no one could fly through that storm," he said, voice hoarse from dust and exhaustion. "They were wrong." Sullivan managed a weak smile. "It wasn't me, sir. It was her." He patted the helicopter's landing strut. "She's special." That night, as Sullivan lay in the medical tent receiving treatment for his wounds, Captain Harding returned. In his hands was a small leather pouch. "My father gave me this before I deployed," Harding said, placing it beside Sullivan's cot. "Said a good soldier always keeps the right tools close. I think you'll make better use of it than I will." Sullivan accepted the gift with the solemn understanding that passed between men who had faced death together. Neither knew then that the leather tool pouch would remain with him for the next 3 decades, or that the helicopter they had christened Desert Storm would one day bring them together again in circumstances less desperate but no less meaningful. The memory faded as Sullivan blinked in the harsh Arizona sunlight. Jason Reed stood before him, awaiting instruction, his earlier arrogance replaced by something approaching humility. "We need to run a full systems check," Sullivan said, his voice drawing Jason back from his own thoughts. "Start with the fuel pressures at all test points. I want to see the actual readings, not just the computer's interpretation." "Yes, sir," Jason replied, the sir coming naturally now. He hesitated. "Sergeant Sullivan, I want to apologize. The way I treated you was inexcusable." Sullivan regarded him steadily. "You're not the first young man to think he knows everything, and you won't be the last." A slight smile softened his words. "Though most don't have the courage to admit when they're wrong." That simple acknowledgement, recognizing Jason's apology without dwelling on the offense, seemed to release some of the tension in the younger man's shoulders. He nodded gratefully and moved to begin the systems check. Sullivan turned to find Airman Peterson standing nearby, a look of quiet admiration on his face. "Something on your mind, Airman?" "My grandfather was a mechanic in Korea, sir," Peterson said. "He always told me that machines have souls. No one ever believed him, including me." He glanced at Desert Storm. "I think I understand now." Sullivan studied the young airman thoughtfully. "What's your first name, son?" "Michael, sir. Michael Peterson." "Well, Michael, your grandfather was a wise man. The best mechanics don't just fix machines, they listen to them." Sullivan gestured toward Desert Storm. "Want to learn something they don't teach in technical training?" Peterson's face lit up. "Yes, sir." For the next hours, preparations for the ceremony continued around them. Sullivan worked with Jason and Michael, showing them aspects of helicopter maintenance that appeared in no manual. He taught them to feel the subtle vibrations that indicated potential problems, to distinguish between normal operational sounds and the warning notes of impending failure, to understand the interconnected nature of systems that engineers often treated as separate entities. Jason, despite his advanced degrees, found himself absorbing knowledge that no university could provide, the accumulated wisdom of decades of hands-on experience, the intuitive understanding that came from working on aircraft under the most extreme conditions imaginable. "It's not just about the individual components," Sullivan explained as they inspected the rotor assembly. "It's about how they work together, how they affect each other. A helicopter is greater than the sum of its parts. It develops a personality over time, habits and quirks that won't show up on any diagnostic." As they worked, other technicians gradually drifted closer, initially pretending to be engaged in their own task, but increasingly drawn to Sullivan's impromptu masterclass. Lieutenant Bennett, after a brief conversation with General Harding, had retreated to handle administrative details of the upcoming ceremony, seemingly grateful for the excuse to make himself scarce. Sullivan noted the growing audience but didn't alter his approach. He continued working with quiet efficiency, explaining what he was doing and why, answering questions without condescension. These young technicians, so confident with their digital diagnostics and computer models, were experiencing something many of them had never encountered before: the art behind the science of aviation maintenance. Inside the base command center, General Harding stood before a wall of monitors displaying live feeds from around the facility. One screen showed Sullivan working with the technicians around Desert Storm. Harding watched the scene with a mixture of satisfaction and melancholy. Colonel James Mitchell, the base commander, entered the room and came to stand beside him. "The ceremony preparations are on schedule, General. The VIPs have been informed of the slight delay but are all present and accounted for." Harding nodded without taking his eyes from the screen. "Good." Mitchell followed his gaze. "If I may ask, sir, who exactly is Sullivan? The way you spoke about him—" Harding was silent for a long moment. "Frank Sullivan is the reason I'm standing here today, Colonel. The reason a lot of men are still standing." He pointed to the screen. "That helicopter, Desert Storm, made 7 extractions during Operation Desert Storm. 7 missions that were classified as impossible, given the conditions. Sullivan kept it flying when everything said it should be grounded." "He must have been an exceptional technician," Mitchell observed. "He was more than that." Harding's voice took on a distant quality. "In '91, we had a saying, mechanics fix what's broken. Sullivan makes the impossible fly. The men called him the Ghost because he could keep birds in the air that should have been dead and grounded." The general turned away from the screen. "After my team was extracted, I recommended Sullivan for the Medal of Honor. It was downgraded to the Air Force Cross. Typical bureaucracy, they said. Performing maintenance, no matter how heroic, didn't qualify for our highest decoration." A flash of old anger crossed his face. The fact that he did it while hanging from a moving helicopter under enemy fire with shrapnel in his arm apparently wasn't above and beyond enough. Mitchell looked startled. He performed repairs while outside the aircraft during flight. Twice. Harding nodded. Once during a sandstorm, once under heavy fire. The second time he was already wounded. He shook his head slowly. Men like Sullivan don't come along often, Colonel. They do what needs doing, not for recognition, not for reward, but because lives depend on them getting it right. What happened to him after the war? Mitchell asked. Harding's expression darkened. He came home, was promoted to Master Sergeant, continued his service until his wife Sarah got sick. Cancer. He retired to care for her. After she passed, he trailed off. We lost touch. My career was taking off, and Frank just wanted to be left alone. The general straightened his moment of reflection, passing. I should have reached out sooner, kept in better contact. 30 years is too long. Colonel Mitchell knew better than to offer platitudes to a four-star general. Instead, he simply said, "It seems like today might be a new beginning, sir." Harding nodded. Perhaps it is, Colonel. Perhaps it is. Back on the tarmac, the final preparations for Desert Storm's ceremonial flight were nearly complete. Sullivan, Jason, and Airman Peterson had just finished adjusting the rotor tracking when Lieutenant Bennett returned, his posture still stiff with formal propriety. Sergeant Sullivan, Bennett began, his tone carefully neutral. General Harding has requested a status update. The ceremony begins in 30 minutes. Sullivan nodded. She's ready, just completing the final checks now. He turned to Jason. Run through the pre-flight one more time, focusing on the fuel pressure at transition points. If anything looks off by even 2%, let me know immediately. Jason moved to comply, his earlier reluctance replaced by focused professionalism. The transformation in the young engineer was remarkable, from dismissive arrogance to attentive respect in the span of 2 hours. Bennett hesitated, clearly struggling with what to say next. Sergeant, I want to apologize for my behavior earlier. It was unprofessional and disrespectful. Sullivan studied the lieutenant for a moment. The young officer stood rigidly at attention, bracing for whatever reprimand might come his way. Instead, Sullivan simply extended his hand. In the field, Lieutenant, we didn't have time for long apologies. A man acknowledged his mistake and moved forward. That was good enough then. It's good enough now. Bennett blinked in surprise, then shook Sullivan's hand firmly. Thank you, sir. As Bennett withdrew, visibly relieved, Sullivan turned his attention to the helicopter. Despite the 30 years that separated him from active service, his body remembered the pre-mission routine, the heightened alertness, the sharpened senses, the calm clarity that came with accepting responsibility for lives other than his own. Jason approached, tablet in hand. All systems are green, Sergeant. Desert Storm is ready to fly. Who's piloting her for the ceremony? Sullivan asked. Major Ellis, 20 years of experience, over 3,000 hours in Blackhawks. Good. I'd like to speak with one of him before takeoff. Jason hesitated. There's just one thing. He glanced toward the base headquarters. General Harding has requested that you accompany Major Ellis during the ceremonial flight. He says Desert Storm should have her crew chief on board for her final public appearance. Sullivan stared at the helicopter, emotions crossing his weathered face too quickly to read. Sarah wouldn't approve, he murmured so softly that Jason barely caught the words. Sir, Sullivan shook his head. Nothing. He straightened, decision made. Tell the general I'll be on board. Major Ellis arrived 15 minutes before the scheduled ceremony started, a tall, imposing figure in his flight suit. He greeted Sullivan with professional courtesy. Sergeant Sullivan, it's an honor. General Harding briefed me on your history with this aircraft. I'll consider it a privilege to have you aboard. Sullivan nodded. Thank you, Major. I have a few specific notes about her handling characteristics, if you have a moment. The two men moved toward the cockpit, Sullivan explaining the subtle idiosyncrasies that made Desert Storm unique. The slight pull to port during transition to forward flight, the optimal collective position for minimum vibration, the engine response curve that differed from standard Blackhawk parameters due to Sullivan's modifications. Major Ellis listened attentively, asking insightful questions that revealed his own deep understanding of helicopter aerodynamics. I wish all my aircraft came with their own expert consultant, he said with genuine appreciation. This kind of knowledge usually takes dozens of flight hours to develop. As they completed the pre-flight checklist together, Sullivan felt a twinge of nostalgia. How many times had he run through these same procedures in years past? How many missions had begun with these familiar rituals? The weight of memory pressed against him not unpleasantly, but with the bittersweet quality of revisiting a chapter of life long closed. Outside, the ceremony was beginning. Through the cockpit window, Sullivan could see the distinguished guests taking their seats in the viewing stands. American flags snapped in the breeze. Military police in dress uniforms stood at attention, creating a corridor through which Desert Storm would taxi before takeoff. General Harding approached the helicopter, exchanging a brief word with Major Ellis before turning to Sullivan. "All set, Frank," he asked, the formal military demeanor momentarily set aside. Sullivan nodded. "Just like old times, Sam, except no one's shooting at us." Harding smiled, the expression transforming his stern features. "The day's still young." He reached out and gripped Sullivan's shoulder. "Thank you for this. It means a lot to me, to the men who served with us, to the whole damned Air Force, whether they know it or not." Before Sullivan could respond, Harding was gone, striding toward the reviewing stand, where he would deliver the opening remarks for the ceremony. Major Ellis began the engine start sequence, and Desert Storm responded with her characteristic rumble, the sound building to a healthy roar as the turbine spooled up to operating speed. Sullivan settled into the crew chief's position, muscle memory guiding him through the familiar motions. Through the window, he could see Jason and the other technicians watching with expressions ranging from professional satisfaction to outright wonder. Airman Peterson stood slightly apart, his face showing the unguarded admiration of youth for accomplishment. As Desert Storm's rotor blades accelerated to flight speed, Sullivan felt the old magic taking hold, the transformation of separate mechanical components into a singular living entity. The vibrations changed subtly, harmonizing into the distinctive rhythm he knew so well. The helicopter seemed to awaken fully, no longer merely functional, but alive with purpose. Major Ellis's voice came through the headset. "Ready for taxi, Sergeant." Sullivan took a deep breath, 30 years of memories flooding through him in a single heartbeat. "Ready, Major? Let's show them what she can do." Desert Storm lifted gracefully from the tarmac, hovering momentarily before beginning its approach to the reviewing stand. Below, hundreds of faces turned upward, veterans with graying hair and lined faces alongside young service members in crisp uniforms, all watching as a piece of living history rose into the clear Arizona sky, carrying with it the echoes of battles fought, lives saved, and sacrifices made on distant sands 3 decades before. For Frank Sullivan, the moment transcended the ceremony's formal purpose. This was communion with a part of himself long set aside but never truly forgotten, the young sergeant who had pushed himself beyond all reasonable limits, who had redefined what was possible through sheer will and ingenuity, who had held the lives of others in his skilled hands and never once let them fall. As Desert Storm performed a perfect hover in front of the reviewing stand, Sullivan glanced toward the cockpit where Major Ellis handled the controls with professional precision. The Major caught his eye and nodded respectfully before returning his attention to his instruments. In that moment, Sullivan realized that his legacy lived on not just in the modifications he had made to this particular helicopter, but in the standards he had set, the boundaries he had pushed, the example he had provided to the generations of maintenance personnel who followed. Whether they knew his name or not, every technician who refused to accept impossible as an answer carried something of Frank Sullivan with them. The helicopter banked smoothly away from the reviewing stand, beginning the aerial demonstration that would showcase its capabilities. Major Ellis executed each maneuver with textbook precision, but Sullivan could feel Desert Storm responding with more than mere mechanical compliance. The aircraft moved with the fluid grace of an entity that knew its purpose and embraced it fully. Sullivan allowed himself a small smile as they soared above Jefferson Air Force Base. One last flight indeed, but perhaps not a final farewell after all. Perhaps instead a reconnection to his past, to his purpose, to the person he had been, and in many ways still was. Desert Storm climbed higher into the clear blue sky, sunlight glinting off her rotors, her shadow racing across the desert floor below. And Frank Sullivan, the ghost, who had once made the impossible fly, felt the weight of years and solitude lift from his shoulders, carried away by the rhythm of rotor blades and the familiar embrace of machinery brought to life by human skill and determination. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Jefferson Air Force Base as Desert Storm completed its final pass over the reviewing stand. The demonstration had exceeded all expectations, each maneuver executed with precision that belied the aircraft's 30 years of service. As the helicopter settled onto the tarmac with practiced ease, the assembled crowd rose to their feet, their applause carrying across the base. For the veterans present, Desert Storm embodied more than military hardware. It represented their shared crucible, the swirling sand, the night missions, the brotherhood forged under fire. For the dignitaries and younger personnel, the aircraft served as a tangible link to history, a bridge spanning generations of American warriors. Frank Sullivan remained at his crew chief position as Major Ellis completed the shutdown sequence. The familiar symphony of sounds, turbines spooling down from a roar, to a whisper, hydraulic systems depressurizing with soft sighs, rotor blades slowing, until their shadows swept across the tarmac in ever-widening arcs, brought an unexpected tightness to Sullivan's chest. Not quite nostalgia, but recognition of something vital that had been missing from his life. Remarkable aircraft, Major Ellis commented as he completed the final checklist items. Flies better than machines half her age. The balance on the controls, the way she responds to input, it's almost intuitive. He glanced at Sullivan with professional respect. That kind of performance doesn't come from the factory. That comes from someone who understood her soul. Sullivan acknowledged the compliment with a slight nod. She was always exceptional, not just the airframe, but the modifications we made under combat conditions. Things you can't plan for in an engineering office. As they exited the helicopter, Sullivan was taken aback by the gathering that awaited them. Not just the technical crew, but a group of veterans, from the ceremony men his age wearing Desert Storm caps and unit patches, their military bearing visible beneath civilian clothes. One stepped forward, a tall man with close-cropped silver hair and the weathered face of someone who had seen more than his share of desert sun. Sullivan Frank Sullivan, the ghost. Sullivan hesitated, then nodded, uncomfortable with the recognition. Jim Reeves, 101st Airborne. The man extended his hand. January 22nd, 1991. You pulled my unit out of a hot zone when the sandstorm hit Objective Victor. Command said extraction was impossible. Reeves's voice roughened with emotion. They said we'd have to wait out the storm. We had 3 men with critical injuries who wouldn't have lasted the night. Sullivan remembered. Not the man's name, but the mission, the third of 7 impossible extractions a Desert Storm had performed during that 3-day period when weather had grounded most of the fleet. The sandstorm had reduced visibility to near zero, with winds gusting to 60 knots. Sullivan had installed the experimental intake filters less than 3 hours before launch. I was just doing my job, Sullivan said, the phrase automatic after decades of deflecting recognition. The real credit goes to the pilots who flew in those conditions. Bullshit, Reeves said bluntly. With respect, Sergeant, those pilots wouldn't have gotten airborne without your modifications. Our intelligence officer did some digging after we got back. Found out you'd redesigned the intake system in the field with parts that weren't even in the supply chain. Said it shouldn't have been possible. Another veteran stepped forward, this one leaning on a cane. Davis, 5th Special Forces, February 20th, 1991. You pulled us out under heavy fire south of Basra. Took a round through the fuselage. I saw you hanging out the side of the bird, working on the hydraulics while we were still taking fire. He shook his head in disbelief. 34 years and I've never seen anything like it. More veterans approached, each with a similar story. Sullivan had never sought this recognition, had in truth actively avoided it. He'd done his job as he understood it, keeping aircraft flying, bringing soldiers home. Being confronted with the human impact of his work after so many years left him uncharacteristically off balance. Among the technicians observing this impromptu reunion, Jason Reed watched with dawning understanding. The respect these combat veterans showed Sullivan transcended mere appreciation of technical skill. It was deeper, the profound gratitude of men who had been given more years of life because of one mechanic's refusal to accept limitations. General Harding approached, moving through the gathering with the easy authority of high command. Gentlemen, I hate to interrupt, but Sergeant Sullivan is needed for a debriefing. He placed a hand on Sullivan's shoulder, steering him away. Once they were clear of the crowd, he added quietly, "Thought you might appreciate an extraction of your own." Sullivan gave him a grateful look. "Never been comfortable in the spotlight, Sam. You know that." "I remember." Harding's eyes crinkled at the corners. "Desert Storm might have been the star of the show, but you were never one for taking bows. The general's office stood apart from the utilitarian buildings that dominated the base, a colonial-style structure with a broad porch and polished brass fixtures. Inside the space reflected both Harding's position and personality, spacious but not ostentatious military neat, with carefully chosen personal touches. Sullivan's attention was drawn to a wall of photographs, Harding with three presidents, foreign dignitaries, high-ranking officials from every branch of service. Among these images of power and influence hung a faded photograph that seemed out of place. Two young men standing before a dust-covered Black Hawk, their uniforms stained with sand and grease exhaustion evident in their stance, but triumph in their eyes. A much younger Sam Harding and Frank Sullivan captured moments after the mission that had forged their unlikely friendship. Harding followed Sullivan's gaze. Euphrates Valley, February 27, 1991. 7 hours after you pulled my recon team out of that mess near the highway of death. We looked like hell, Sullivan observed, studying their younger selves. We were running on stims and adrenaline, 72 hours without real sleep. Harding gestured to a leather armchair. Sit, Frank, please. As Sullivan sat, the general retrieved a crystal decanter from a cabinet, pouring 2 fingers of amber liquid into each of 2 glasses. He handed one to Sullivan and took the other to his desk chair. Macallan 25, Harding said, raising his glass, to Desert Storm, both the operation and the aircraft, and to old friends. They drank the familiar warmth of good scotch, easing some of the day's tension from Sullivan's shoulders. For a moment, neither spoke, content to exist in the comfortable silence shared by men who had faced death together. You disappeared, Frank, Harding said finally, his tone free of accusation. After Sarah died, I tried to reach out. Sullivan studied the liquid in his glass. Wasn't much for company those days. And now, a slight shrug. Got used to the quiet, I suppose. Harding observed his old friend with a general's eye for detail. The years had changed Sullivan outwardly, the white hair, the deeper lines in his face, the slight stiffness in his once fluid movements. But the essential qualities remained: the quiet competence, the unpretentious dignity, the unwavering sense of duty that had saved so many lives during those crucial weeks in the desert. I'm retiring next month, Harding said, changing course. 40 years. Figure that's enough. Sullivan raised an eyebrow. Never thought I'd see the day. You were always the lifer. Times change, priorities shift. Harding set his glass down. Which brings me to something I want to discuss with you. A sharp knock interrupted them. Lieutenant Bennett entered, his posture still rigidly formal despite the day's events. Sorry to disturb you, General, but Secretary Lindholm is ready to depart. He's requested a word before his motorcade leaves. Harding nodded. Thank you, Lieutenant. Tell him I'll be there in 5 minutes. As Bennett left, the general turned back to Sullivan with a look of resignation. Duty calls, but this conversation isn't over. Have dinner with me tonight. My quarters, 1900 hours. Nothing formal, just 2 old soldiers catching up. Sullivan hesitated, then nodded. I'll be there. As he left the headquarters building, Sullivan found Jason waiting near the entrance, his expression no longer carrying the arrogant certainty of their first meeting. Sergeant Sullivan, I was hoping to catch you before you left the base. Jason shifted his weight, a hint of nervousness replacing his earlier confidence. What you showed us today, the bypass system, the manual control adjustments, the way you diagnosed problems by sound and feel, it was more than educational. It was revelatory. Sullivan said nothing, allowing the young engineer to find his own words. The modifications you made to Desert Storm, your approach to problem solving under extreme conditions, none of that exists in any manual or training program. Jason hesitated, then pressed on. That knowledge will be lost when... He stopped, reconsidering his phrasing. When dinosaurs like me are extinct, Sullivan suggested, a hint of amusement softening his words. Jason flushed. I didn't mean you're not wrong, Sullivan cut him short. Experience doesn't transfer well to paper. Never has. That's what I wanted to discuss. Jason's uncertainty gave way to earnest enthusiasm. What if we created a program, a structured way to capture that kind of knowledge? Not just technical specifications, but the intuitive understanding that comes from hands-on experience. A bridge between the old ways and the new. Sullivan studied the younger man with renewed interest. The genuine passion in Jason's voice suggested this wasn't merely an attempt to make amends for his earlier behavior. Interesting idea, Sullivan acknowledged. But would anyone listen? Your generation seems pretty confident in your digital diagnostics. We were humbled today, Jason admitted frankly. Not just me, all of us. We spent 6 hours failing to solve a problem that you identified in minutes without any of our technology. That kind of lesson tends to stick. Sullivan considered this surprised by Jason's candor. Perhaps there was more substance to the young engineer than he had initially perceived. I've already spoken with General Harding about developing a formal program, Jason continued. We're calling it the Aviation Heritage Initiative, a systematic approach to preserving the knowledge and techniques that aren't captured in technical manuals. The general is fully supportive. I'll bet he is, Sullivan said dryly. Would you consider being involved? Jason asked. As a consultant and advisor, whatever role you'd be comfortable with. Your expertise could quite literally save lives in future combat situations. The appeal was shrewdly made, touching the core of what had driven Sullivan throughout his career. Not ambition or recognition, but the knowledge that his work directly impacted survival. I'll think about it, he said finally. That's all I can promise for now. Jason nodded, accepting this as more than he might have expected. Thank you, Sergeant. That's enough for me to start putting together a formal proposal. He extended his hand. And thank you for today, for the lesson in humility. I needed it. As they shook hands, Sullivan felt an unexpected sense of connection, not friendship exactly, but a mutual respect that transcended their different backgrounds, ages, and approaches to their shared profession. Sergeant Sullivan, Lieutenant Bennett approached his earlier antagonism, replaced by a newfound deference. There's someone here asking for you, says he's your son. Sullivan froze surprise, momentarily displacing his usual composure. Michael here, Bennett nodded. He's waiting outside the hangar, sir, with his family. Sullivan moved quickly toward the hangar entrance, a complex mixture of emotions churning beneath his controlled exterior. His relationship with Michael had grown increasingly distant in the years since Sarah's death. Their infrequent phone conversations were cordial, but stilted, their rare visits marked by unspoken grievances and misunderstandings. Outside in the bright Arizona sunlight stood Michael Sullivan, a tall man in his mid-40s with his father's build, but his mother's gentler features. Beside him were a woman and a boy of perhaps 10 or 11. Dad, Michael said, stepping forward with an uncertain smile. Michael. Sullivan embraced his son briefly, awkwardly, then stepped back to regard him properly. This is unexpected. We're on our way to the Grand Canyon for Thomas's spring break. Michael gestured to his companions. You remember Karen, and this is Thomas, your grandson. Sullivan nodded to Karen, whom he had met twice before at formal occasions, then turned his attention to the boy. Thomas had Sarah's eyes, the same clear blue that had captivated Sullivan 40 years earlier. The realization caught him unprepared, stirring emotions he had long kept carefully contained. Hello, Thomas, he managed, extending his hand as he would to an adult. The boy shook it solemnly. Hello, Grandpa. Dad says you fix helicopters. Used to, Sullivan corrected gently. I'm retired now. Michael glanced toward the open hangar where Desert Storm was visible. That's not what it looks like from here. There was an edge to his voice that Sullivan recognized, the long simmering resentment of a son who had competed with military duty for his father's attention, who had watched his mother shoulder family responsibilities alone during deployments and training exercises. Just consulting, Sullivan said deliberately, keeping his tone light. A one-time favor for an old friend. An awkward silence followed, heavy with unspoken words. Karen, perceptive to the undercurrents, intervened with practiced diplomacy. Frank, we were hoping you might join us for dinner. We're staying in Phoenix, but we could meet somewhere in between. Sullivan hesitated, caught between his ingrained solitude and the unexpected opportunity to reconnect. Thomas's interested gaze toward the helicopter tipped the balance. Why don't you come to the house instead, he offered, surprising himself. It's closer than Phoenix, and I could grill some steaks. Michael's surprise was evident. His father rarely invited anyone to his home. Are you sure we don't want to impose? It's no imposition, Sullivan glanced at Thomas. Besides, I might have some helicopter models that would interest you, young man. The boy's face brightened. Real models, with moving parts. Sullivan nodded, a small smile softening his weathered features. From different eras, some older than your dad. The tension between father and son eased slightly, their shared focus on Thomas creating neutral ground, where old conflicts might temporarily be set aside. Plans were made for dinner that evening, and as Michael and his family departed, Sullivan found himself experiencing an unfamiliar mixture of anticipation and anxiety. 2 weeks after the Desert Storm ceremony, Sullivan's phone rang one morning as he finished his coffee. The caller ID showed Jefferson Air Force Base. Sullivan? Sergeant Sullivan, this is Lieutenant Bennett. The young officer's voice carried a new respect that would have been unthinkable before their shared experience with Desert Storm. I'm calling on behalf of General Harding. There's a situation he thought you might be interested in. Sullivan felt a familiar stirring, the mixture of curiosity and readiness that had once defined his professional life. What kind of situation? It's Desert Storm, sir. The maintenance team has been preparing her for museum display, and they've discovered something unusual, something they can't identify or match to any known Blackhawk configuration. Sullivan's interest sharpened. What exactly did they find? That's just it, sir. None of the technicians are sure. It appears to be some kind of secondary system integrated with the primary flight controls. The components don't match any standard parts, and the configuration doesn't appear in any technical manuals or schematic. Sullivan knew immediately what they had found, another of his wartime modifications more unorthodox than the fuel bypass system. A control mechanism he had designed and implemented during the final days of Desert Storm, when extraction missions had grown increasingly dangerous and conventional aircraft limitations threatened to ground helicopters precisely when they were most needed. I'll be there in an hour, he said, already moving toward his closet where his old tool bag waited. The drive to Jefferson Base seemed shorter this time, the desert landscape more vibrant, his purpose more defined. Sullivan found himself anticipating the technical challenge, the opportunity to explain one of his most innovative modifications to a new generation of aerospace professionals. At the base, he was surprised to find not just Lieutenant Bennett waiting for him, but Jason Reed as well. The young engineer's face lit up at his arrival. Sergeant Sullivan, thank you for coming. We've got quite the puzzle on our hands. Sullivan nodded in greeting. So I hear. Where's Desert Storm? They led him to a maintenance hangar where the helicopter sat, partially disassembled panels removed to expose internal systems in preparation for its final journey to the Air Force Museum. A team of technicians surrounded one particular section, their discussion animated and technical. As Sullivan approached, the technicians fell silent, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and newfound respect. Jason took the lead, gesturing toward an exposed area beneath the cockpit floor. We found this while documenting systems for the museum transfer. It's integrated with the primary flight controls, but it's like nothing in any of our technical manuals. He pointed to specific components. These actuators aren't standard Blackhawk parts. The control linkages are custom machined. And this, he indicated a small electronic module, appears to be modified from an F-16 weapons targeting system, but it's been completely repurposed. Sullivan crouched beside the exposed section, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth as he recognized his handiwork. A flight control enhancement he had implemented to allow the helicopter to operate in conditions that would normally exceed its design limitations. February 1991, he said, his voice carrying the distant quality of memory. We were running extraction missions in increasingly hostile environments. Standard Blackhawks couldn't maintain stability under the combined conditions we were facing: high temperatures, extreme turbulence, maximum payload, and evasive maneuvers under fire. He traced the connections with practiced fingers. This is what we called the Enhanced Stability Control System, ESCS. It was never officially designated because it was never officially approved. What exactly does it do? Asked a senior chief with 20 years of helicopter experience. It allows the pilot to temporarily override the factory flight control limitations, Sullivan explained. In layman's terms, it makes the helicopter do things the engineers said it couldn't do. Such as, Jason prompted, operate at 15% over maximum gross weight, maintain controlled flight in crosswinds exceeding 60 knots, execute high-angle banking turns while fully loaded. Sullivan's technical explanation grew more detailed as he warmed to the subject. The core innovation is the predictive compensation algorithm. I adapted it from an F-16 targeting system that calculated wind resistance and trajectory adjustment, reprogrammed it to predict rotor stress, and automatically adjust the control surfaces to compensate. Jason's eyes widened. You deliberately bypass safety limiters. That's dangerous under normal circumstances, Sullivan acknowledged. But these weren't normal circumstances. We needed helicopters that could carry more wounded, fly faster through hostile airspace, and maintain stability while evading ground fire. The factory specifications weren't designed for what we were facing. He pointed to additional components. There are multiple redundant fail-safes built in. The system can only be activated under specific conditions, requires constant pilot acknowledgement, and automatically disengages if structural integrity is compromised beyond safe parameters. The technicians exchanged glances, professional appreciation overcoming their initial concern about the unorthodox modification. The remarkable thing, Sullivan continued, is that the system worked flawlessly through 7 consecutive extraction missions. We pushed Desert Storm to 143% of her design limits during the Basra corridor extraction, and she performed perfectly. How did you develop this? Jason asked, genuine admiration in his voice. The integration with the existing flight controls is seamless. Sullivan considered how to explain the process that had seemed so natural to him. I started by studying how pilots compensated manually for stress factors. Then I broke down each adjustment into its mechanical components. The challenge was creating a system that could predict needed adjustments before the pilot would feel them, essentially getting ahead of the physics. The discovery session evolved into an impromptu masterclass with Sullivan explaining the principles behind his modifications, the circumstances that necessitated them, and the engineering insights that made them possible. The technicians from the most senior to the most junior listened with rapt attention, occasionally asking questions that revealed both their technical expertise and their growing appreciation for Sullivan's unorthodox brilliance. Among them, Airman Peterson seemed particularly fascinated, his expression reminiscent of a student who had discovered a vocation rather than merely a job. The young airman's questions were thoughtful, revealing an intuitive understanding that reminded Sullivan of himself at a similar age. Sir, Peterson asked during a pause, how did you test these modifications? The risk factors seem extraordinarily high. Sullivan's expression grew solemn. The first test pilot was always me, son. I never asked a pilot to fly with a modification I hadn't tested myself. But you're not a pilot, one of the technicians objected. No, Sullivan agreed, but I understood the mechanical systems better than anyone. If something went wrong, I could identify and potentially fix it in flight. He didn't mention that this approach had nearly cost him his life, twice once when a modified tail rotor assembly failed during a test flight, sending the helicopter into an uncontrolled spin at 3,000 feet. As the session concluded, Jason pulled Sullivan aside. This is exactly what I meant about the Heritage Initiative, Sergeant. This kind of knowledge, this approach to problem solving, it's invaluable. And it's not something we can learn from manuals or simulators. Sullivan nodded, acknowledging the point without committing himself. General Harding has approved the program framework. Jason continued, we're developing a curriculum that combines classroom theory with hands-on application. Veterans with field experience paired with current technicians. Real-world problem-solving under simulated combat conditions. Sounds comprehensive, Sullivan said neutrally. We need you involved, Sergeant, Jason pressed gently. Not necessarily full-time, but in a capacity that works for you. Your expertise could be the difference between mission success and failure in the next conflict. Sullivan didn't answer immediately. He had given the matter considerable thought in the 2 weeks since their initial discussion. The dinner with Harding had provided additional details, including the scope and importance the Air Force was placing on the initiative. What had begun as an impulsive idea was developing into something substantial, a systematic approach to preserving the intuitive knowledge that came only through hands-on experience in high-pressure environments. The kind of knowledge that had saved 67 lives during those critical days in Desert Storm. I'll consider it, Sullivan said finally. Send me the full proposal. I want to see exactly what you're planning. Jason's face brightened. Absolutely, I'll have it to you by tomorrow. Hard copy, Sullivan specified. No email. Jason's smile faltered only briefly. Of course. Hard copy it is. Sullivan's modest home had never felt quite so alive. The dining table, rarely extended to its full length, now accommodated 4 place settings. The refrigerator, usually stocked with just the basics for one, bulged with provisions for a proper family dinner. The living room, typically silent, save for the occasional ticking of clocks Sullivan had repaired, now resonated with the curious questions of a 10-year-old boy. Thomas moved carefully among the shelves of model aircraft, his eyes wide with fascination. You built all these, Grandpa, Sullivan nodded, watching his grandson with an unfamiliar warmth spreading through his chest. Most of them. Some were gifts from the crews I worked with. The boy pointed to a particularly detailed Black Hawk model. Is this like Desert Storm, the helicopter you fixed today? Similar. That's an earlier model, but the basic design is the same. Bush Sullivan reached past Thomas and took down a different model, slightly smaller, but more intricate in its details. This one is closer to Desert Storm. Notice the modified air intakes and the non-standard exhaust configuration. Thomas studied it with intense concentration. Did you make those changes? I did, during the Gulf War. Sullivan found himself explaining the purpose of each modification, simplifying the technical aspects, without talking down to the boy. Thomas absorbed it all with genuine interest, asking surprisingly perceptive questions. From across the room, Michael observed this interaction with a complex mixture of emotions evident in his expression. Sullivan caught his son's eye, recognizing the unspoken question there. Why had this side of him, the patient teacher, the keeper of fascinating history, been so rarely displayed during Michael's own childhood? The evening progressed with cautious optimism. Karen proved skilled at bridging awkward silences with well-timed questions about Sullivan's models, his house, his life in Arizona. Thomas, unburdened by the historical tensions between father and grandfather, moved freely in his curiosity, drawing out stories from Sullivan that even Michael had never heard. As they sat down to dinner, steaks grilled to perfection, baked potatoes, fresh vegetables from Sullivan's small garden, the conversation tentatively expanded beyond safe topics. Dad? Michael began carefully. What exactly were you doing at the base today? I thought you were fully retired. Sullivan considered his response, aware that his son had always viewed his military career with ambivalence. The maintenance team found another modification I made to Desert Storm during the war. They couldn't identify it because it was never officially documented. What kind of modification? Thomas asked, instantly intrigued. A control system enhancement, Sullivan explained. It allowed the helicopter to fly in conditions that would normally ground at severe crosswinds, maximum payload, high temperatures. Is that why they called you in? Karen asked. Because no one else understood how it worked. Exactly. Sullivan glanced at Michael, sensing his son's complex reaction to this reminder of his father's specialized expertise. The system was field expedient, designed and implemented under combat conditions. Never went through official engineering review or approval. Michael's expression remained carefully neutral, but Sullivan could read the familiar tension there, the lifetime of competing with helicopters and missions and responsibilities that had always seemed to take precedence over family events. The Air Force is developing a program, Sullivan continued, deliberately shifting focus to preserve this kind of field knowledge, the experience-based understanding that doesn't make it into technical manuals. They've asked me to consult. Are you going to do it? Thomas asked, his directness refreshing after years of adults who approached the subject obliquely. Sullivan met his grandson's curious gaze. I'm considering it. You should, Thomas said with the straightforward certainty of childhood. Dad says you're the best helicopter mechanic ever. Sullivan looked at Michael in surprise. His son's face flushed slightly. I might have mentioned it once or twice, Michael admitted, when Thomas was building model planes and got frustrated. I told him his grandfather could build or fix anything that flew. The simple statement hung in the air between them, an unexpected acknowledgement, a small bridge extended across years of distance and misunderstanding. Your father exaggerates, Sullivan said to Thomas, his voice rougher than usual. But I appreciate the vote of confidence. As dinner concluded and Karen began helping Thomas prepare for bed in the guest room, Sullivan found himself alone with his son for the first time in years. They sat on the back porch watching the desert stars emerge in the darkening sky, each nursing a glass of bourbon. It's a good program, Michael said after a long silence. The one the Air Force is proposing, preserving knowledge from veterans. Sullivan glanced at him, surprised by the supportive comment. I may have resented the time your career took from our family. Michael continued staring into his glass, but I never doubted its importance. What you knew, what you could do, it mattered. It saved lives. I wasn't always there when you and your mother needed me, Sullivan acknowledged, the closest he had ever come to an apology for the absences that had marked Michael's childhood. No, you weren't. Michael's voice held old pain, but not accusation. But Mom always said you were where you needed to be, where others needed you more urgently than we did. Sullivan studied his son's profile in the dim porch light, recognizing Sarah's diplomatic phrasing, her generous interpretation of his frequent deployments and training rotations. Sarah was always too forgiving, Sullivan said quietly. Michael smiled faintly. She said you'd say that. He turned to face his father directly. You know what else she told me after she got sick when we knew the treatment wasn't working? Sullivan shook his head, his chest tightening at the memory of that terrible time. She made me promise to keep trying with you. She said once she was gone, you'd build walls around yourself that would be almost impossible to breach. Michael's smile turned sad. She knew you pretty well. She always did, Sullivan agreed, his voice barely audible. I haven't kept that promise very well, Michael admitted. It was easier to tell myself you preferred being alone. Sullivan considered his response carefully, aware that this moment represented a rare opportunity to begin healing a relationship long defined by absence and misunderstanding. I got used to being alone, he said finally. Doesn't mean I preferred it. The simple statement opened a door between them, not a full reconciliation, but a beginning. Michael nodded, acknowledging both the admission and its significance. This program at the base, he said after another comfortable silence. It sounds like something that might be worth your time. Sullivan raised an eyebrow. You think so? I'm a surgeon, Dad. I understand the value of knowledge that can't be fully captured in textbooks or training simulations. The intuition that comes only from experience. Michael swirled the bourbon in his glass. If you have the chance to pass that on, to make it available to others who might need it someday, he shrugged. Seems like the right thing to do. Sullivan studied his son with new appreciation, recognizing the thoughtful man who had emerged from the resentful boy he had too often disappointed. Perhaps Sarah's influence, perhaps his own path to maturity, perhaps both had shaped Michael into someone capable of seeing beyond personal grievance to larger purpose. I've been reviewing their proposal, Sullivan said. The Aviation Heritage Initiative. It's ambitious, combining classroom instruction with hands-on application under simulated combat conditions. Sounds like something you could contribute to substantially. Sullivan nodded. I've been thinking about specifics, ways to structure the program to maximize real-world application. The Air Force tends toward over-documentation. Some things can't be taught from a manual. Michael smiled slightly. Some things need to be felt. Exactly. Sullivan was struck by his son's intuitive understanding. There's a tacit knowledge component that's difficult to articulate. Like knowing when a patient is developing sepsis before the blood work shows it, Michael offered. Experienced surgeons just know. We call it clinical judgment, but it's really pattern recognition built through thousands of cases. Yes, Sullivan agreed, surprised by the parallel. For me, it was the sound of an engine, the pattern of vibration through the airframe, things you feel more than measure. They talked for another hour, finding unexpected common ground in their respective technical fields. As the conversation wound down, Michael glanced at his watch. We should get back to the hotel. Thomas has school starting back next week, so we need to finish the Grand Canyon trip and head home. Sullivan nodded, feeling a reluctance to end the evening that would have been unimaginable a few weeks earlier. Before you go, he said, rising from his chair, there's something I want to give Thomas. In his bedroom, Sullivan opened the bottom drawer of his dresser and removed a small wooden box he hadn't touched in years. Inside, nestled in cotton, lay a precisely crafted model helicopter, a UH-1 Huey from his early days as a crew chief before Desert Storm. He had built it during his first deployment, spending countless off-duty hours shaping each part by hand. He returned to the living room where Thomas was examining the model collection again. Thomas, Sullivan said, holding out the box, I'd like you to have this. The boy took it carefully, his eyes widening as he lifted the model from its cotton bed. I made this when I was a young crew chief, Sullivan explained. My first helicopter. It's amazing how... Thomas breathed, turning it slowly to examine every detail. You really made this yourself. Sullivan nodded. Every part, hand-carved from scrap materials. Thank you, Grandpa. Thomas looked up, his expression serious beyond his years. I'll take really good care of it. I know you will. Sullivan rested his hand briefly on the boy's shoulder. Maybe next time you visit, we could build one together. Thomas's face lit up. Really like a new one from scratch. From scratch, Sullivan confirmed. I'll teach you how. The boy's excitement was palpable as he carefully returned the model to its box. When the family departed, their goodbyes held a warmth that had been absent from previous partings. Michael embraced his father firmly, the gesture conveying more than words could express. Karen invited Sullivan to visit them in Seattle. Thomas extracted a solemn promise about the model building project. Later that night, after they had gone, Sullivan stood in his living room contemplating the photograph of Sarah that had served as his touchstone for so many years. "Quite a day," he said softly to the image of his late wife. "Our son, our grandson, the old helicopter. All at once," he smiled faintly. "You'd say it wasn't coincidence, you'd call it an opportunity." The photograph offered no response, but in the quiet of his home, now seeming emptier for having briefly been full of family, Sullivan felt a clarity that had eluded him since Sarah's death. The comfortable isolation he had constructed around himself suddenly seemed less like peace and more like stagnation. 3 days later, Sullivan drove to Jefferson Air Force Base with a manila folder containing his formal response to the Aviation Heritage Initiative proposal. He had spent the intervening time making detailed notes, developing a structured approach that would bridge the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application. General Harding met him in his office, a look of pleased surprise crossing his face as Sullivan handed him the folder. "You've given this serious thought," Harding observed, leafing through the neatly organized pages. "It's a worthwhile project," Sullivan replied simply, "if done correctly." The modifications Sullivan had proposed were substantial, but focused, reducing classroom theory in favor of hands-on application, developing scenario-based training modules drawn from actual combat operations, creating a mentor system that paired experienced veterans with promising young technicians. "This is exactly what we need," Harding said after reviewing the document. "Technical expertise grounded in real-world experience." He looked up. "I take it this means you're on board?" Sullivan nodded. "As a consultant, not full-time. I'll help develop the curriculum and participate in the hands-on training modules. 3 days a month plus availability for special projects." "Agreed," Harding said without hesitation. "We'll make it official next week." As Sullivan drove home that evening, he felt a sense of purpose he had not experienced in years. The Aviation Heritage Initiative would preserve not just his own knowledge, but the accumulated wisdom of dozens of veterans whose field innovations had never made it into technical manuals. Their legacy would continue through generations of technicians who would face their own challenges in future conflicts. Parallel to this professional renewal, Sullivan found himself contemplating the possibility of repairing his relationship with Michael and building a genuine connection with Thomas. Small steps at first: phone calls, visits, shared projects, but steps in a direction he had avoided for too long. He pulled into his driveway as the desert sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. For the first time in years, Frank Sullivan was looking forward rather than backward, considering not what he had lost, but what he might yet gain, not who he had been, but who he might still become. The change was subtle but profound, a shift from existence to living, from memory to possibility, from solitary preservation to active engagement. Frank Sullivan, the ghost, who had once made the impossible fly, felt something stirring within himself, the awakening of possibilities he had thought permanently foreclosed, the rekindling of purpose he had believed extinguished. Not a return to who he had been, but a new integration of past and present, a new way of being useful, of mattering, of living, rather than merely existing. The details of implementation remained to be worked out, both for the Heritage Initiative and for his personal reconnections. But the direction was clear, the decision made. Frank Sullivan was ready to emerge from the shadows, to share what he knew, to connect with those who could benefit from his experience. Ready at long last to build bridges rather than walls, to engage rather than retreat, to look forward rather than backward. Ready in his own quiet way to fly again.